With regulations, I think there's not really good regulations out there for high-speed rail currently because we don't really have high-speed rail. So for a starting point, I thought that the Federal Railroad Administration kind of has an unorganized basis. They kind of address it a little bit, but there's nothing really there concrete for high-speed rail. So I thought a good system that does seem pretty efficient, economically viable, and is popular is airline industry. And so the FAA analogy is what I came up with. So Title 14 of the Code of Regulations by the Government Printing Office covers the FAA, NASA, etc. Chapters 1 and 2 are relevant for us. Title 49 covers all other sorts of transportation. The Federal Railroad Administration is Chapter 2 out of like 11 chapters. So for the FAA, they have a lot of regulations, but it's pretty well organized. Each of these subheadings is like a subchapter, and it's pretty well categorized and tiered. And so in the brackets, I kind of put like what the equivalent analogy would be for each thing if we went with that kind of structure for regulations. Definitions and procedural rules are just kind of basic outlines of what the regulations are, and from there. So for brevity, the most important one that I thought was like terminals. That kind of has to do with like your TOD stations, and that's kind of like beginning and end of a trip. And so that's kind of like the most important thing for the experience of the rider. The other one is the air carriers and operators for compensation. Who's going to operate? Is it the private versus the public argument, that kind of question, that debate. So, of course, they talk about cargo versus passengers, which is like our freight and passenger debate. This is more. When the FAA regulations were outlined, a lot of it was concerned with economic viability. The federal government didn't want to invest a lot of money into a system if it wasn't going to have good returns. So just making the ground-based regulations for logistics and speed and classes of track is not going to go far enough to help us regulate sales, manifest, baggage, international travel, and insurance liabilities, commuting, and also procedural regulations, like what happens when there's a change of service, additions to service. You know, we need a good, smooth system to really help us with that, rather than just kind of making it up on the fly. So I'm going to start with the FAA regulations, go through that, and then go through the FRA current regulations for rail. The FAA, I just kind of going to focus on the airports, which is the analogy with the high-speed rail station. Parts 154 and 152 underneath subchapter I, if you follow, really has to do with a lot of federal aid. The federal government kind of commits a lot to the airports and the airports within the community. So, you know, to give funding, the plans must have local input and objections, written statements, must talk about housing if you're displacing housing. Of course, noise compliance. Under noise compliance, there's environmental regulations and all that good stuff. And it also must have like at least one sponsor or a multitude of sponsors. It can be any kind of a local municipality, county, state agency, anything like that. So there's going to be some sort of responsibility in the public sector locally to help run and regulate the airports. The same thing could apply to high-speed rail. If you have a vested interest, it's going to be more successful. And also, as far as funding goes, the FAA does allow up to $4.50 passenger facility charges. That is also regulated with, are you a large hub, a small hub? There are like maximums underneath that, $3, $2, $1, depending on the amount of traffic going through. So it really helps the system flow. And it prevents any one airport from being much more successful than another airport. Now let's hop into the rail regulations. Title 49, it's not very well organized. You can see that there's no subheadings, tiers. It's all kind of, there's a lot more regulations than this. I kind of picked out 10 or so that might be relevant for high-speed rail passenger services. And within it, it gets kind of detailed as far as, you know, what kind of axles to use and stuff like that. But for the most part, it's a hodgepodge. There's not a whole lot of organization. It's harder to follow, and a lot of it has to do with just federal programs for money. And so, not even just regulations of the economic side beyond the federal government's role. I bolded and highlighted 5 different categories, if you will, to focus on that are more relevant in this presentation. Start with section 238.5 defines a railroad as any kind of among other things, it includes high-speed ground transportation systems, which will basically allow the FRA to go ahead and, under its umbrella, include high-speed rail if and when it is adopted. So that means it already kind of has a starting point, but at the same time, it already has a place, and we can't do something else creatively unless we nix this definition. So if we wanted to say the High-Speed Rail Administration, we can't have that under the current regulations because FRA wants to help regulate. So it's just kind of like, I'm not saying that that's good or bad, but you know, it is what it is. Also, talking about speeds, these numbers represent miles per hour. And this is freight, and this is passenger rail, and these are maximum speed limits on different classes of track. Now there are 9 classes defined, but as far as I can tell, there are no class 9 in existence in North America, or at least in the United States. And class 7 and 8 currently exist on the Northeast Corridor, the Acela line for Amtrak. But it does say freight. Freight is much more highly restricted for class 6 and above because they say, well, it has to have aerodynamic qualities in the cars. The weight of the freight and the weight of the cargo cannot diminish the performance of the car. It's for stability purposes. But you can see that most of the tracks, if they're not classified as class 6 and above, which has to do with engineering qualities too, we just can't have high-speed rail. But I thought this was interesting because later on we'll see that there are no safety standards for above 150 miles per hour. Okay, part 238, safety standards. This is what I'm talking about. It says for passenger equipment, that's the cars, tracks, locomotives, etc., there's only Tier 1 and Tier 2. There is no Tier 3. Tier 1 is anything slower than 125 miles per hour, which is going to be the majority of rail in America. And anything between 125 and 150 is going to be regulated on Tier 2. However, a lot of high-speed rail systems go faster than 150 miles per hour, especially internationally. And a lot of designs that we look at go beyond 150 miles per hour, but there are no safety regulations. There are no extra explicit guidelines for how to build cars, how to build the axles, the wheel bearings, etc. So that's a huge concern that we need to incorporate. Now, as far as financial assistance goes, passenger terminals is a big part of the TOD area, and currently federal share, they will take up to 80% of the share of the project, and there's 3 types of funds. And they're outlined as demonstration funds, preservation funds, and planning funds. But the one thing that I thought was really interesting is to help with the terminal must be on the National Register. That's not always easy to do, but it's doable. Preservation funds, you know, if you can prove that's threatened or it's deteriorating, then they will get funds for that. Demonstration funds, it's probably the easiest way to do it. Must be intermodal, must have intermodal plans into it, which is a good thing. And the last, planning funds, this is also good. You must meet local zoning requirements and land use patterns. They require a 2-year horizon or less for any construction projects. Don't know what would happen if it goes beyond 2 years, but like I said, it must be intermodal. But the thing that caught my eye was that it must be likely to attract private investors in the operation of the train station. So, what does that mean? How do you even define likely to attract private investors, and what does that mean as far as the operation of high-speed rail and the operation of train stations? Are we already saying that private investment is required and that it's not going to be a solely public operation? Part 260. No subheading still, but it has to do with loans and railroad rehabilitation and improvement. And essentially, it's just for loans and loan guarantees to, if say a local entity wants to take on a project, it's not a grant, you have to repay it back, and of course no one really wants to take a loan at one of those grants, but no one wants to go into debt. It's for anything beyond operating expenses. It must be intermodal, which is a good thing, but the administrator of the Federal Railroad Administration will give priority consideration for projects that are for public safety, or if it's a project that addresses environmental needs, or say that there's economic development issues in the area. If this project can demonstrate that it meets one of these needs or all of these needs, then you're more likely to get the funding. However, there's also priority for small and rural area services, which is not what high-speed rail really is. It's not when it's most effective. 262, capital grants. Grants are great, but it's not for really improvement of rail, it's for the relocation of rail lines. So if we want to relocate freight rail and then to say a different corridor and then install high-speed rail on the existing corridors, so say move freight rail to the periphery of cities, this funding would help with that, but then where's the construction money for the new high-speed rail coming into play? That also would cost a lot of money to completely move a freight rail line, if that's what you're looking for. And if you want to say it's part of the economic development or it's part of quality of life concerns, you can try to justify it, but as far as I can see, there's very limited stipulations and limited instances where these stipulations can be met. And all this kind of has to do with federal money with strings attached, so in all these cases. But overall, recommendations and conclusions, the top three are recommendations for things that we need to address that are currently not addressed, or not addressed far enough. And also I would kind of say, maybe we ought to think of a regulation system that's much more like the FAA to ensure economic viability, to ensure success of high-speed rail, rather than fitting it in with an unorganized system of regulations. Things that currently are there, local input is a very key thing in preservation of architectural integrity, and never bad things. It helps with the experience of the train station, for example. You were talking about Grand Central Station. That definitely is kind of part of a high-speed rail system, of any kind of transportation system. So that's overall, that's kind of where we stand on regulations. That's the nitty-gritty. So, any questions?